Chapter 24. If the Dharma Bums ever get lay brothers in America who live normal lives with wives and children and homes, they will be like Sean Monahan. Sean was a young carpenter who lived in an old wooden house far up a country road from the huddled cottages of Corte Madera, drove an old jalopy, personally added a porch to the back of the house to make a nursery for later children, and had selected a wife who agreed with him in every detail about how to live the joyous life in America without much money. Sean liked to take days off from his job to just go up the hill to the shack, which belonged to the property he rented, and spend a day of meditation and study of the Buddhist sutras and just brewing himself pots of tea and taking naps. His wife was Christine, a beautiful young honey-haired girl, her hair falling way down over her shoulders, who wandered around the house and yard barefooted, hanging up wash and baking her own brown bread and cookies. She was an expert on making food out of nothing. The year before, Jaffe had made them an anniversary gift, which was a huge 10-pound bag of flour, and they were very glad to receive it. Sean, in fact, was just an old-time patriarch. Though he was only 22, he wore a full beard like St. Joseph, and in it you could see his pearly white teeth smiling and his young blue eyes twinkling. They already had 2 little daughters, who also wandered around barefooted in the house and yard, and were brought up to take care of themselves. Sean's house had woven straw mats on the floor, and there too, when you came in, you were required to take off your shoes. He had lots of books, and the only extravagance was a hi-fi set, so he could play his fine collection of Indian records and flamenco records and jazz. He even had Chinese and Japanese records. The dining table was a low, black-lacquered Japanese-style table, and to eat in Sean's house you not only had to be in your socks, but sitting on mats at this table, any way you could. Christine was a great one for delicious soups and fresh biscuits. When I arrived there at noon that day, getting off the Greyhound bus and walking up the tar road about a mile, Christine immediately had me sit down to hot soup and hot bread with butter. She was a gentle creature. "Sean and Jaffe are both working on his job at Sausalito. They'll be home about 5. I'll go up to the shack and look at it and wait up there this afternoon." "Well, you can stay down here and play records." "Well, I'll get out of your way." "You won't be in my way. All I'm going to do is hang out the wash and bake some bread for tonight and mend a few things." With a wife like that, Sean, working only desultorily at carpentry, had managed to put a few $1,000s in the bank. And like a patriarch of old, Sean was generous. He always insisted on feeding you, and if 12 people were in the house, he'd lay out a big dinner, a simple dinner but delicious, on a board outside in the yard, and always a big jug of red wine. It was a communal arrangement, though. He was strict about that. We'd make collections for the wine, and if people came, as they all did, for a long weekend, they were expected to bring food or food money. Then at night, under the trees and the stars of his yard, with everybody well-fed and drinking red wine, Sean would take out his guitar and sing folk songs. Whenever I got tired of it, I'd climb my hill and go sleep. After eating lunch and talking a while to Christine, I went up the hill. It climbed steeply right at the back door, huge ponderosas and other pines, and in the property adjoining Sean's a dreamy horse meadow with wildflowers and 2 beautiful bays with their sleek necks bent to the butterfat grass in the hot sun. "Boy, this is going to be greater than North Carolina woods," I thought, starting up. In the slope of grass was where Sean and Jaffe had felled 3 huge eucalyptus trees and had already bucked them, sawed whole logs, with a chainsaw. Now the block was set, and I could see where they had begun to split the logs with wedges and sledgehammers and double-bitted axes. The little trail up the hill went so steeply that you almost had to lean over and walk like a monkey. It followed a long cypress road that had been planted by the old man who had died on the hill a few years ago. This prevented the cold, foggy winds from the ocean from blasting across the property unhindered. There were 3 stages to the climb: Sean's backyard, then a fence, forming a little pure deer park where I actually saw deer one night, 5 of them, resting. The whole area was a game refuge. Then the final fence and the top grassy hill with its sudden hollow on the right where the shack was barely visible under trees and flowery bushes. Behind the shack, a well-built affair, actually of 3 big rooms, but only one room occupied by Jaffe, was plenty of good firewood and a sawhorse and axes and an outdoor privy with no roof, just a hole in the ground and a board. It was like the first morning in the world in fine yard, with the sun streaming in through the dense sea of leaves, and birds and butterflies jumping around. Warm, sweet, the smell of higher hill heathers and flowers beyond the barbed wire fence, which led to the very top of the mountain, and showed you a vista of all the Marin County area. I went inside the shack. On the door was a board with Chinese inscriptions on it. I never did find out what it meant. Probably Mara stay away, Mara the tempter. Inside I saw the beautiful simplicity of Jaffe's way of living, neat, sensible, strangely rich without a cent having been spent on the decoration. Old clay jars exploded with bouquets of flowers picked around the yard. His books were neatly stacked in orange crates. The floor was covered with inexpensive straw mats. The walls, as I say, were lined with burlap, which is one of the finest wallpapers you can have, very attractive and nice-smelling. Jaffe's mat was covered with a thin mattress and a paisley shawl over that, and at the head of it, neatly rolled for the day, his sleeping bag. Behind burlap drapes in a closet, his rucksack and junk were put away from sight. From the burlap wall hung beautiful prints of old Chinese silk paintings and maps of Marin County and Northwest Washington and various poems he'd written and just stuck on a nail for anybody to read. The latest poem, superimposed over others on the nail, said, "It started just now with a hummingbird stopping over the porch 2 yards away through the open door, then gone. It stopped me studying, and I saw the old redwood post leaning in clod ground, tangled in a huge bush of yellow flowers higher than my head, through which I push every time I come inside. The shadow network of the sunshine through its vines. White-crowned sparrows make tremendous singings in the trees. The rooster down the valley crows and crows. Sean Monahan outside, behind my back, reads the Diamond Sutra in the sun. Yesterday I read Migration of Birds, the golden plover and the Arctic tern. Today that big abstraction's at my door, for juncos and the robins soon will leave, and nesting scrabblers will pick up all the string, and soon in hazy day of April summer heat across the hill, without a book I'll know, the seabirds'll chase spring north along the coast. They'll be nesting in Alaska in 6 weeks." And it was signed, Japheth M. Ryder, Cypress Cabin, 18 Roman 3, 56. I didn't want to disturb anything in the house till he got back from work, so I went out and lay down in the tall green grass in the sun and waited all afternoon, dreaming. But then I realized I might as well make a nice supper for Jaffe, and I went down the hill again and down the road to the store, and bought beans, salt pork, various groceries, and came back and lit a fire in the wood stove and boiled up a good pot of New England beans with molasses and onions. I was amazed at the way Jaffe stored his food, just on a shelf by the wood stove. 2 onions, an orange, a bag of wheat germ, cans of curry powder, rice, mysterious pieces of dried Chinese seaweed, a bottle of soy sauce to make his mysterious Chinese dishes. His salt and pepper was all neatly wrapped up in little plastic wrappers bound with elastic. There wasn't anything in the world Jaffe would ever waste or lose. Now I was introducing into his kitchen all the big substantial pork and beans of the world. Maybe he wouldn't like it. He also had a big chunk of Christine's fine brown bread, and his bread knife was a dagger simply stuck into the board. It got dark, and I waited in the yard, letting the pot of beans keep warm on the fire. I chopped some wood and added it to the pile behind the stove. The fog began to blow in from the Pacific. The trees bowed deeply and roared. From the top of the hill, you could see nothing but trees, trees, a roaring sea of trees. It was paradise. As it got cold, I went inside and stoked up the fire, singing, and closed the windows. The windows were simply removable opaque plastic pieces that had been cleverly carpentered by Whitey Jones, Christine's brother. They let in light, but you couldn't see anything outdoors, and they cut off the cold wind. Soon it was warm in the cozy cabin. By and by I heard a hoo out in the roaring sea of fog trees, and it was Jaffe coming back. I went out to greet him. He was coming across the tall, final grass, weary from the day's work, clomping along in his boots, his coat over his back. "Well, Smith, here you are. I cooked up a nice pot of beans for you." "You did?" He was tremendously grateful. "Boy, what a relief to come home from work and don't have to cook up a meal yourself. I'm starved." He pitched right into the beans with bread and hot coffee I made in a pan on the stove, just French-style brewing coffee stirred with a spoon. We had a great supper, and then lit up our pipes and talked with the fire roaring. "Ray, you're going to have a great summer up on that Desolation Peak. I'll tell you all about it." "I'm going to have a great spring right here in this shack." "Darn right. First thing we do this weekend is invite some nice new girls I know. Psyche and Polly Whitmore. Though wait a minute. I can't invite both of them. They both love me and'll be jealous. Anyway, we'll have big parties every weekend, starting downstairs at Sean's and ending up here. And I'm not working tomorrow, so we'll cut some firewood for Sean. That's all he wants you to do. Though if you want to work on that job of ours in Sausalito next week, you can make $10 a day." "Fine. That'll buy a lot of pork and beans and wine." Jaffe pulled out a fine brush drawing of a mountain. "Here's your mountain that'll loom over you, Hosamine. I drew it myself 2 summers ago from Crater Peak. In 1952, I first went into that Skagit country, hitched from Frisco to Seattle and then in, with a beard just started and a bare-shaved head." "Bare-shaved head? Why?" "To be like a bhikkhu. You know what it says in the sutras." "But what did people think about you hitchhiking around with a bare-shaved head?" "They thought I was crazy, but everybody that gave me a ride, I'd spin 'em the Dharmy boy and leave 'em enlightened." "I should have done a bit of that myself hitching out here just now. I gotta tell you about my arroyo in the desert mountains." "Wait a minute. So they put me on Crater Mountain Lookout, but the snow was so deep in the high country that year, I worked trail for a month, first in Granite Creek Gorge. You'll see all those places. And then with a string of mules, we made it the final 7 miles of winding Tibetan rock trail above timberline over snowfields to the final jagged pinnacles, and then climbed the cliffs in a snowstorm, and I opened my cabin and cooked my first dinner while the wind howled and the ice grew on 2 walls in the wind. Boy, wait till you get up there. That year my friend Jack Joseph was on Desolation, where you'll be." "What a name, Desolation. Ooh, wow, ugh, wait." "He was the first lookout to go up. I got him on my radio first off, and he welcomed me to the community of lookouts. Later, I contacted other mountains. See, they give you a 2-way radio. It's almost a ritual. All the lookouts chat and talk about bears they've seen, or sometimes ask instructions for how to bake muffins on a wood stove and so on. And there we all were in a high world, talking on a net of wireless across hundreds of miles of wilderness. It's a primitive area where you're going, boy. From my cabin, I could see the lamps of Desolation after dark, Jack Joseph reading his geology books. And in the day, we flashed by mirror to align our firefinder transits, accurate to the compass. Gee, how will I ever learn all that? I'm just a simple poet bum. Oh, you'll learn the magnetic pole, the pole star, and the northern lights. Every night, Jack Joseph and I talked. One day, he got a swarm of ladybugs on the lookout that covered the roof, and filled up his water cistern. Another day he went for a walk along the ridge and stepped right on a sleeping bear. Oh ho, I thought this place was wild. This is nothing. And when the lightning storm came by, closer and closer, he called to finally say he was going off the air because the storm was too close to leave his radio on. He disappeared from sound and then sight as the black clouds swept over and the lightning danced on his hill. But as the summer passed, Desolation got dry and flowery and Blakey lambs, and he wandered the cliffs, and I was on Crater Mountain in my jockstrap and boots hunting out ptarmigan nests out of curiosity, climbing and pooking about, getting bit by bees. Desolation's way up there, Ray, 6,000 feet or so up, looking into Canada and the Chelan Highlands, the wilds of the Picket Range, and mountains like Challenger, Terror, Fury, Despair. And the name of your own ridge is Starvation Ridge, and the upcountry of the Boston Peak and Buckner Peak Range to the south, thousands of miles of mountains, deer, bear, conies, hawks, trout, chipmunks. It'll be great for you, Ray. I look forward to it, okay. I bet no bee bites me. Then he took out his books and read a while, and I read too, both of us with separate oil lamps banked low, a quiet evening at home as the foggy wind roared in the trees outside, and across the valley a mournful mule hee-hawed in one of the most tremendously heartbroken cries I've ever heard. "When that mule weeps like that," says Jaffe, "I feel like praying for all sentient beings." Then for a while he meditated motionless in the full lotus position on his mat, and then said, "Well, time for bed." But now I wanted to tell him all the things I'd discovered that winter meditating in the woods. "Aw, that's just a lot of words," he said, sadly, surprising me. "I don't want to hear all your word description of words you made up all winter. Man, I want to be enlightened by actions." Jaffe had changed since the year before, too. He no longer had his goatee, which had removed the funny, merry little look of his face, but left him looking gaunt and rocky-faced. Also, he'd cut his hair in a close crew-cut and looked Germanic and stern, and above all, sad. There seemed to be some kind of disappointment in his face now, and certainly in his soul. He wouldn't listen to my eager explanations that everything was all right forever and forever and forever. Suddenly he said, "I'm going to get married soon, I think. I'm getting tired of batting around like this." "But I thought you discovered the Zen ideal of poverty and freedom." "Oh, maybe I'm getting tired of all that. After I come back from the monastery in Japan, I'll probably have my fill of it anyhow. Maybe I'll be rich and work and make a lot of money and live in a big house." But a minute later, "And who wants to enslave himself to a lot of all that, though? I don't know, Smith, I'm just depressed, and everything you're saying just depresses me further. My sister's back in town, you know." "Who's that?" "That's Rhoda, my sister. I grew up with her in the woods in Oregon. She's going to marry this rich jerk from Chicago, a real square. My father's having trouble with his sister, too, my Aunt Nos. She's an old bitch from way back." "You shouldn't have cut off your goatee. You used to look like a happy little sage." "Well, I ain't happy little sage no mo', and I'm tired." He was exhausted from a long, hard day's work. We decided to go to sleep and forget it. In fact, we were a bit sad and sore at each other. During the day, I had discovered a spot by a wild rose bush in the yard where I planned to lay out my sleeping bag. I'd covered it a foot deep with fresh-pulled grass. Now, with my flashlight and my bottle of cold water from the sink tap, I went out there and rolled into a beautiful night's rest under the sighing trees, meditating a while first. I couldn't meditate indoors anymore like Jaffe had just done. After all that winter in the woods of night, I had to hear the little sounds of animals and birds, and feel the cold, sighing earth under me before I could rightly get to feel a kinship with all living things as being empty and awake and saved already. I prayed for Jaffe. It was like he was changing for the worse. At dawn, a little rain pattered on my sleeping bag, and I put my poncho over me instead of under me, cursing, and slept on. At 7 in the morning the sun was out, and the butterflies were in the roses by my head, and a hummingbird did a jet dive right down at me, whistling, and darted away happily. But I was mistaken about Jaffe changing. It was one of the greatest mornings in our lives. There he was, standing in the doorway of the shack with a big frying pan in his hand, banging on it, and chanting, "Buddham Suranam Gocchami, Dhammam Suranam Gocchami, Sangham Suranam Gocchami," and yelling, "Come on, boy, your pancakes are ready. Come and get it. Bang, bang, bang." And the orange sun was pouring in through the pines, and everything was fine again. In fact, Jaffe had contemplated that night, and decided I was right about hewing to the good old Dharma. Chapter 25. Jaffe had cooked up some good buckwheat pancakes, and we had log cabin syrup to go with them and a little butter. I asked him what the Gocchami chant meant. That's the chant they give out for the 3 meals in Buddhist monasteries in Japan. It means Buddham Saranam Gocchami, I take refuge in the Buddha. Sangham, I take refuge in the church. Dhammam, I take refuge in the Dharma, the truth. Tomorrow morning I'll make you another nice breakfast. Slumgullion. Did you ever eat good old-fashioned slumgullion, boy? Tain't nothing but scrambled eggs and potatoes all scrambled up together. It's a lumberjack meal? There ain't no such thing as lumberjack. That must be a back east expression. Up here we call 'em loggers. Come on, eat up your pancakes, and we'll go down and split logs, and I'll show you how to handle a double-bitted axe. He took the axe out and sharpened it and showed me how to sharpen it. And don't ever use this axe on a piece of wood that's on the ground. You'll hit rocks and blunt it. Always have a log or something for a block. I went out to the privy, and coming back, wishing to surprise Jaffy with a Zen trick, I threw the roll of toilet paper through the open window, and he let out a big samurai warrior roar and appeared on the windowsill in his boots and shorts with a dagger in his hand and jumped 15 feet down into the loggy yard. It was crazy. We started downhill feeling high. All the logs that had been bucked had more or less of a crack in them, where you more or less inserted the heavy iron wedge, and then, raising a 5-pound sledgehammer over your head, standing way back so as not to hit your own ankle, you brought it down concho on the wedge and split the log clean in half. Then you'd sit the half logs up on a block log and let down with a double-bitted axe, a long, beautiful axe, sharp as a razor, and for whap, you had quarter logs. Then you set up a quarter log and brought it down to an eighth. He showed me how to swing the sledge and the axe, not too hard, but when he got mad himself, I noticed he swung the axe as hard as he could, roaring his famous cry, or cursing. Pretty soon I had the knack and was going along as though I'd been doing it all my life. Christine came out in the yard to watch us and called, "I'll have some nice lunch for you." "Okay." Jaffy and Christine were like brother and sister. We split a lot of logs. It was great swinging down the sledgehammer, all the weight clank on top of a wedge and feeling that log give, if not the first time, the second time. The smell of sawdust, pine trees, the breeze blowing over the placid mountains from the sea, the meadowlarks singing, the butterflies in the grass. It was perfect. Then we went in and ate a good lunch of hot dogs and rice and soup and red wine and Christine's fresh biscuits, and sat there cross-legged and barefoot thumbing through Sean's vast library. "Did you hear about the disciple who asked the Zen master, 'What is the Buddha?'" "No, what?" "The Buddha is a dried piece of turd," was the answer. The disciple experienced sudden enlightenment. "Simple shit," I said. "Do you know what sudden enlightenment is? One disciple came to a master and answered his koan, and the master hit him with the stick and knocked him off the veranda 10 feet into a mud puddle. The disciple got up and laughed. He later became a master himself. 'Twasn't by words he was enlightened, but by that great healthy push off the porch. All wallowing in mud to prove the crystal truth of compassion, I thought. I wasn't about to start advertising my words out loud any more to Jaffy. "Whew!" he yelled, throwing a flower at my head. "Do you know how Kasyapa became the first patriarch? The Buddha was about to start expounding a sutra, and 1,250 bhikkhus were waiting with their garments arranged and their feet crossed, and all the Buddha did was raise a flower. Everybody was perturbed. The Buddha didn't say nothing. Only Kasyapa smiled. That was how the Buddha selected Kasyapa. That's known as the flower sermon, boy." I went in the kitchen and got a banana and came out and said, "Well, I'll tell you what nirvana is." "What?" I ate the banana and threw the peel away and said nothing. "That's the banana sermon." "Who?" yelled Jaffy. "Did I ever tell you about Coyote Old Man and how him and Silver Fox started the world by stomping in empty space till a little ground appeared beneath their feet? Look at this picture, by the way. This is the famous bulls." It was an ancient Chinese cartoon showing first a young boy going out into the wilderness with a small staff and pack, like an American Nat Wills tramp of 1905. And in later panels he discovers an ox, tries to tame, tries to ride it, finally does tame it and ride it, but then abandons the ox and just sits in the moonlight, meditating. Finally you see him coming down from the mountain of enlightenment, and then suddenly the next panel shows absolutely nothing at all, followed by a panel showing blossoms in a tree. Then the last picture, you see the young boy is a big fat old laughing wizard with a huge bag on his back, and he's going into the city to get drunk with the butchers, enlightened. And another new young boy is going up to the mountain with a little pack and staff. It goes on and on. The disciples and the masters go through the same thing. First they have to find and tame the ox of their mind essence, and then abandon that, Then finally they attain to nothing, as represented by this empty panel. Then, having attained nothing, they attain everything, which is springtime blossoms in the trees, so they end up coming down to the city to get drunk with the butchers like Lipo. That was a very wise cartoon. It reminded me of my own experience, trying to tame my mind in the woods, then realizing it was all empty and awake and I didn't have to do anything, and now I was getting drunk with the butcher Jaffe. We played records and lounged around smoking, then went out and cut more wood. Then as it got cool late afternoon, we went up to the shack and washed and dressed up for the big Saturday night party. During the day, Jaffe went up and down the hill at least 10 times to make phone calls and see Christine and get bread and bring up sheets for his girl that night. When he had a girl, he put out clean sheets on his thin mattress on the straw mats, a ritual. But I just sat around in the grass doing nothing, or writing haikus, or watching the old vultures circling the hill. Must be something dead around here, I figured. Jaffe said, "Why do you sit on your ass all day?" I practice do nothing. What's the difference? Burn it, my Buddhism is activity. And Jaffe rushed off down the hill again. Then I could hear him sawing wood and whistling in the distance. He couldn't stop jiggling for a minute. His meditations were regular things, by the clock. He'd meditated first thing waking in the morning, then he had his mid-afternoon meditation, only about 3 minutes long, then before going to bed, and that was that. But I just ambled and dreamed around. We were two strange, dissimilar monks on the same path. I took a shovel, however, and leveled the ground near the rose bush where my bed of grass was. It was a little too slanty for comfort. I fixed it just right, and that night I slept well after the big wine party. The big party was wild. Jaffe had a girl called Polly Whitmore come out to see him, a beautiful brunette with a Spanish hairdo and dark eyes. A regular raving beauty, actually, a mountain climber, too. She'd just been divorced and lived alone in Millbrae. And Christine's brother, Whitey Jones, brought his fiancée Patsy. And of course, Sean came home from work and cleaned up for the party. Another guy came out for the weekend, big blonde Bud Diefendorf, who worked as a janitor in the Buddhist Association to earn his rent and attend classes free. A big, mild, pipe-smoking Buddha with all kinds of strange ideas. I liked Bud. He was intelligent, and I liked the fact that he had started out as a physicist at the University of Chicago, then gone from that to philosophy, and finally now to philosophy's dreadful murderer, Buddha. He said, "I had a dream one time that I was sitting under a tree picking on a lute and singing, 'I ain't got no name.' I was the no-name bhikkhu." It was so pleasing to meet so many Buddhists after that harsh road hitchhiking. Sean was a strange mystical Buddhist with a mind full of superstitions and premonitions. "I believe in devils," he said. "Well," I said, stroking his little daughter's hair, "all little children know that everybody goes to heaven." To which he assented tenderly with a sad nod of his bearded skull. He was very kind. He kept saying "I" all the time, which went with his old boat that was anchored out in the bay and kept being scuttled by storms, and we had to row out and bail it out in the cold gray fog. Just a little old wreck of a boat about 12 feet long, with no cabin to speak of, nothing but a ragged hull floating in the water around a rusty anchor. Whitey Jones, Christine's brother, was a sweet young kid of 20 who never said anything and just smiled and took ribbings without complaint. For instance, the party finally got pretty wild, and the 3 couples took all their clothes off and danced a kind of quaint, innocent polka, all hand in hand around the parlor, as the kiddies slept in their cribs. This didn't disturb Bud and me at all. We went right on smoking our pipes and discussing Buddhism in the corner. In fact, that was best because we didn't have girls of our own. And those were 3 well-stacked nymphs dancing there. But Jaffe and Sean dragged Patsy into the bedroom and pretended to be trying to make her to bug Whitey, who blushed all red, stark naked, and there were wrestlings and laughs all around the house. Bud and I were sitting there cross-legged with naked dancing girls in front of us, and laughed to realize that it was a mighty familiar occasion. "Seems like in some previous lifetime, Ray," said Bud. "You and I were monks in some monastery in Tibet where the girls danced for us before Yabyum." "Yeah, and we were the old monks who weren't interested in sex anymore, but Sean and Jaffe and Whitey were the young monks and were still full of the fire of evil and still had a lot to learn." Every now and then, Bud and I looked at all that flesh and licked our lips in secret. But most of the time, actually, during these naked revels, I just kept my eyes closed and listened to the music. I was really sincerely keeping lust out of my mind by main force and gritting of my teeth. And the best way was to keep my eyes closed. In spite of the nakedness and all, it was really a gentle little home party, and everybody began yawning for time for bed. Whitey went off with Patsy, Jaffy went up the hill with Polly and took her to his fresh sheets, and I unrolled my sleeping bag by the rose bush and slept. Bud had brought his own sleeping bag and rolled out on Sean's straw mat floor. In the morning, Bud came up and lit his pipe and sat in the grass, chatting to me as I rubbed my eyes to waking. During the day, Sunday, all kinds of other people came calling on the Monahans, and half of them came up the hill to see the pretty shack and the two crazy famous bhikkhus, Jaffy and Ray. Among them were Princess, Alva, and Warren Coghlan. Sean spread out a board in the yard and put out a royal table of wine and hamburgers and pickles, and lit a big bonfire, and took out his two guitars, and it was really a magnificent kind of way to live in sunny California, I realized, with all this fine Dharma connected with it, and mountain climbing. All of them had rucksacks and sleeping bags, and some of them were going hiking that next day on the Marin County trails, which are beautiful. So the party was divided into 3 parts all the time. Those in the living room listening to the hi-fi or thumbing through books, those in the yard eating and listening to the guitar music, and those on the hilltop in the shack brewing pots of tea and sitting cross-legged, discussing poetry and things and the Dharma, or wandering around in the high meadow to go see the children fly kites or old ladies ride by on horseback. Every weekend was the same mild picnic, a regular classical scene of angels and dolls having a kind, flowery time in the void, like the void in the cartoon of the bulls, the blossom branch. Bud and I sat on the hill watching kites. "That kite won't go high enough. It hasn't got a long enough tail," I said. Bud said, "Say, that's great. That reminds me of my main problem in my meditations. The reason why I can't get really high into nirvana is because my tail isn't long enough." He puffed and pondered seriously over this. He was the most serious guy in the world. He pondered it all night and the next morning said, "Last night I saw myself as a fish swimming through the void of the sea, going left and right in the water without knowing the meaning of left and right. But because of my fin I did so, that is my kite tail. So I'm a Buddha fish and my fin is my wisdom." "That was pretty infinite, that kite," says I. Throughout all these parties, I always stole off for a nap under the eucalyptus trees instead of by my rose bush, which was all hot sun all day. In the shade of the trees, I rested well. One afternoon, as I just gazed at the topmost branches of those immensely tall trees, I began to notice that the uppermost twigs and leaves were lyrical happy dancers, glad that they had been apportioned the top, with all that rumbling experience of the whole tree swaying beneath them, making their dance, their every jiggle, a huge and communal and mysterious necessity dance, and so just floating up there in the void, dancing the meaning of the tree. I noticed how the leaves almost looked human, the way they bowed and then leaped up and then swayed lyrically side to side. It was a crazy vision in my mind, but beautiful. Another time under those trees I dreamt I saw a purple throne all covered with gold, some kind of eternity pope or patriarch in it, and Rosie somewhere, and at that moment Cody was in the shack yakking to some guys, and it seemed that he was to the left of this vision as some kind of archangel. And when I opened my eyes I saw it was only the sun against my eyelids. And as I say, that hummingbird, a beautiful little blue hummingbird no bigger than a dragonfly, kept making a whistling jet dive at me, definitely saying hello to me every day, usually in the morning, and I always yelled back at him a greeting. Finally he began to hover in the open window of the shack, buzzing there with his furious wings, looking at me beadily, then flash, he was gone. That California humming guy. Though sometimes I was afraid he would drive right into my head with his long beaker like a hat pin. There was also an old rat scrambling in the cellar under the shack, and it was a good thing to keep the door closed at night. My other great friends were the ants, a colony of them that wanted to come in the shack and find the honey. calling all ants, come and get your honey," sang a little boy one day in the shack. So I went out to their anthill and made a trail of honey leading them into the back garden, and they were at that new vein of joy for a week. I even got down on my knees and talked to the ants. There were beautiful flowers all around the shack, red, purple, pink, white. We kept making bouquets, but the prettiest of all was the one Jaffe made of just pine cones and a sprig of pine needles. It had that simple look that characterized all his life. He'd come barging into the shack with his saw and see me sitting there and say, "Why did you sit around all day?" I am the Buddha known as the quitter. Then it would be when Jaffe's face would crease up in that funny little boy laugh of his, like a Chinese boy laughing, crow's tracks appearing on each side of his eyes and his long mouth cracking open. He was so pleased with me sometimes. Everybody loved Jaffe. The girls Polly and Princess and even married Christine were all madly in love with him, and they were all secretly jealous of Jaffe's favorite doll, Psyche, who came the following weekend real cute in jeans and a little white collar falling over her black turtleneck sweater, and a tender little body and face. Jaffe had told me he was a bit in love with her himself, but he had a hard time convincing her to make love. He had to get her drunk. Once she got drinking, she couldn't stop. That weekend she came, Jaffe made slumgullion for all the three of us in the shack. Then we borrowed Sean's jalopy and drove about 100 miles up the seacoast to an isolated beach, where we picked mussels right off the washed rocks of the sea and smoked them in a big wood fire covered with seaweed. We had wine and bread and cheese, and Psyche spent the whole day lying on her stomach in her jeans and sweater, saying nothing. But once she looked up with her little blue eyes and said, "How oral you are, Smith. You're always eating and drinking." "I am Buddha Empty-Eat," I said. "Ain't she cute?" said Jaffe. "Psyche," I said, "this world is the movie of what everything is. It is one movie, made of the same stuff throughout, belonging to nobody, which is what everything is." "Ah, baloney." We ran around the beach. At one point, Jaffe and Psyche were hiking up ahead on the beach, and I was walking alone whistling Stan Getz's Stella. And a couple of beautiful girls up front with their boyfriends heard me, and one girl turned and said, "Swing." There were natural caves on that beach where Jaffe had once brought big parties of people and had organized naked bonfire dances. Then the weekdays would come again and the parties were over, and Jaffe and I would sweep out the shack, we dried bums dusting small temples. I still had a little left of my grant from last fall in traveler's checks, and I took one and went to the supermarket down on the highway and bought flour, oatmeal, sugar, molasses, honey, salt, pepper, onions, rice, dried milk, bread, beans, black-eyed peas, potatoes, carrots, cabbage, lettuce, coffee, big wood matches for our wood stove, and came staggering back up the hill with all that and a half-gallon of red port. Jaffe's neat little spare food shelf was suddenly loaded with too much food. "What we going to do with all this? We'll have to feed all the bhikkhus." In due time, we had more bhikkhus than we could handle. Poor drunken Joe Mahoney, a friend of mine from the year before, would come out and sleep for 3 days and recuperate for another crack at North Beach and the place. I'd bring him his breakfast in bed. On weekends, sometimes there'd be 12 guys in the shack, all arguing and yakking, and I'd take some yellow cornmeal and mix it with chopped onions and salt and water, and pour out little Johnny-cake tablespoons in the hot frying pan, with oil, and provide the whole gang with delicious hots to go with their tea. In the Chinese Book of Changes a year ago, I had tossed a couple of pennies to see what the prediction of my fortune was, and it had come out, "You will feed others." In fact, I was always standing over a hot stove. "What does it mean that those trees and mountains out there are not magic but real?" I'd yell, pointing outdoors. "What?" they'd say. "It means that those trees and mountains out there are not magic but real." "Yeah?" Then I'd say, "What does it mean that those trees and mountains aren't real at all, just magic?" "Oh, come on." "It means that those trees and mountains aren't real at all, just magic." "Well, which is it, goddammit?" "What does it mean that you ask? Well, which is it, goddammit?" I yelled. "Well, what?" "It means that you ask, well, which is it, goddammit?" "Oh, go bury your head in your sleeping bag. Bring me a cup of that hot coffee." I was always boiling big pots of coffee on the stove. "Oh, cut it out," yelled Warren Coghlan. "The chariot will wear down." One afternoon I was sitting with some children in the grass, and they asked me, Why is the sky blue? Because the sky is blue. I want to know why the sky is blue. The sky is blue because you want to know why the sky is blue. Blue, blue, you, they said. There were also some little kids who came around throwing rocks on our shack roof, thinking it was abandoned. One afternoon, at the time when Jaffe and I had a little jet-black cat, they came sneaking to the door to look in. Just as they were about to open the door, I opened it, with the black cat in my arms, and said in a low voice, "I am the ghost." They gulped and looked at me and believed me and said, "Yeah." Pretty soon they were over the other side of the hill. They never came around throwing rocks again. They thought I was a witch for sure. Chapter 26. Plans were being made for Jaffe's big farewell party a few days before his boat sailed for Japan. He was scheduled to leave on a Japanese freighter. It was going to be the biggest party of all time, spilling out of Sean's hi-fi living room right out into the bonfire yard and up the hill and even over it. Jaffe and I had had our fill of parties and were not looking forward to it too happily, but everybody was going to be there. All his girls, including Psyche, and the poet Cacoethes, and Coghlan, and Alva, and Princess and her new boyfriend, and even the director of the Buddhist Association, Arthur Wayne, and his wife and sons, and even Jaffe's father, and of course Bud, and unspecified couples from everywhere who would come with wine and food and guitars. Jaffe said, "I'm getting sick and tired of these parties. How about you and me taking off for the Marin Trails after the party? It'll go on for days. We'll just bring our packs and take off for Potrero Meadows Camp or Laurel Dell." Good. Meanwhile, suddenly, one afternoon, Jaffe's sister Rhoda appeared on the scene with her fiancé. She was going to be married in Jaffe's father's house in Mill Valley, big reception and all. Jaffe and I were sitting around in the shack in a drowsy afternoon, and suddenly she was in the door, slim and blonde and pretty, with her well-dressed Chicago fiancé, a very handsome man. "Who?" yelled Jaffe, jumping up and kissing her in a big passionate embrace, which she returned wholeheartedly. And the way they talked. "Well, is your husband going to be a good bang?" "He damn well is. I picked him out real careful, you grunge jumper." "He'd better be or you'll have to call on me." Then to show off, Jaffe started a wood fire and said, "Here's what we do up in that real country up north," and dumped too much kerosene into the fire but ran away from the stove and waited like a mischievous little boy, and broom! The stove let out a deep rumbling explosion way inside that I could feel the shock of clear across the room. He'd almost done it that time. Then he said to her poor fiancé, "Well, you know any good positions for honeymoon night?" The poor guy had just come back from being a serviceman in Burma, and tried to talk about Burma, but couldn't get a word in edgewise. Jaffe was mad as hell and really jealous. He was invited to the fancy reception, and he said, "Can I show up naked?" "Anything you want, but come." I can just see it now, the punch bowl and all the ladies in their lawn hats and the hi-fi playing Hearts and Flowers organ music, and everybody wiping their eyes 'cause the bride is so beautiful. "What you want to get all involved in the middle class for, Rhoda?" She said, "Oh, I don't care. I want to start living." Her fiancé had a lot of money. Actually, he was a nice guy, and I felt sorry for him having to smile through all this. After they left, Jaffe said, "She won't stay with him more than 6 months. Rhoda's a real mad girl. She'd rather put on jeans and go hiking than sit around Chicago apartments." "You love her, don't you?" "You're damn right. I ought to marry her myself." "But she's your sister." "I don't give a goddamn. She needs a real man like me. You don't know how wild she is. You weren't brought up with her in the woods." Rhoda was real nice, and I wished she hadn't shown up with a fiancé. In all this welter of women, I still hadn't got one for myself. Not that I was trying too hard, but sometimes I felt lonely to see everybody paired off and having a good time, and all I did was curl up in my sleeping bag in the rose bushes and sigh and say bah. For me it was just red wine in my mouth and a pile of firewood. But then I'd find something like a dead crow in the deer park and think, that's a pretty sight for sensitive human eyes, and all of it comes out of sex. So I put sex out of my mind again. As long as the sun shined, then blinked and shined again, I was satisfied. I would be kind and remain in solitude. I wouldn't poke about. I'd rest and be kind. Compassion is the guide star, said Buddha. Don't dispute with the authorities or with women. Beg. Be humble. I wrote a pretty poem addressed to all the people coming to the party. Are in your eyelids wars and silk, but the saints are gone, all gone, safe to that other. I really thought myself a kind of crazy saint, and it was based on telling myself, Ray, don't run after liquor and excitement of women and talk. Stay in your shack and enjoy natural relationship of things as they are. But it was hard to live up to this with all kinds of pretty broads coming up the hill every weekend and even on weeknights. One time a beautiful brunette finally consented to go up the hill with me, and we were there in the dark on my mattress day mat, when suddenly the door burst open and Sean and Joe Mahoney danced in laughing, deliberately trying to make me mad. Either that, or they really believed in my effort at asceticism and were like angels coming in to drive away the devil woman. Which they did all right. Sometimes, when I was really drunk and high and sitting cross-legged in the midst of the mad parties, I really did see visions of wholly empty snow in my eyelids, and when I opened them I'd see all these good friends sitting around waiting for me to explain, and nobody ever considered my behavior strange, quite natural among Buddhists. And whether I opened my eyes to explain something or not, they were satisfied. During that whole season, in fact, I had an overwhelming urge to close my eyes in company. I think the girls were terrified of this. What's he always sitting with his eyes closed for? Little Prajna, Sean's 2-year-old daughter, would come and poke at my closed eyelids and say, Booba, hack! Sometimes I preferred taking her for little magic walks in the yard, holding her hand, to sitting yakking in the living room. As for Jaffe, he was quite pleased with anything I did, provided I didn't pull any boners like making the kerosene lamp smoke from turning the wick too far up, or failing to sharpen the axe properly. He was very stern on those subjects. You've got to learn, he'd say. Damn it, if there's anything I can't stand is when things ain't done right. It was amazing the suppers he'd roused up out of his own part of the food shelf. All kinds of weeds and dry roots bought in Chinatown, and he'd boil up a mess of stuff, just a little, with soy sauce, and that went on top of freshly boiled rice and was delicious indeed, eaten with chopsticks. There we were, sitting in the roar of trees at dusk, with our windows wide open still, cold, but going chomp-chomp on delicious homemade Chinese dinners. Jaffe really knew how to handle chopsticks and shoveled it in with a will. Then I'd sometimes wash the dishes and go out to meditate a while on my mat beneath the eucalypti, and in the window of the shack I'd see the brown glow of Jaffe's kerosene lamp as he sat reading and picking his teeth. Sometimes he'd come to the door of the shack and yell, "Who?" and I wouldn't answer, and I could hear him mutter, "Where the hell is he?" and see him peering out into the night for his bhikkhu. One night I was sitting meditating when I heard a loud crack to my right, and I looked, and it was a deer, coming to revisit the ancient deer park and munch a while in the dry foliage. Across the evening valley the old mule went with his heartbroken hee-haw, broken like a yodel in the wind, like a horn blown by some terribly sad angel, like a reminder to people digesting dinners at home that all was not as well as they thought. Yet it was just a love cry for another mule. But that was why. One night I was meditating in such perfect stillness that 2 mosquitoes came and sat on each of my cheekbones and stayed there a long time without biting, and then went away without biting. Chapter 27. A few days before his big farewell party, Jaffe and I had an argument. We went into San Francisco to deliver his bike to the freighter at the pier, and then went up to Skid Row in a drizzling rain to get cheap haircuts at the barber college, and poke around Salvation Army and Goodwill stores in search of long underwear and stuff. As we were walking in the drizzly, exciting streets, "Reminds me of Seattle," he yelled. I got the overwhelming urge to get drunk and feel good. I bought a poor boy of ruby port and uncapped it and dragged Jaffe into an alley, and we drank. "You better not drink too much," he said. "You know we gotta go to Berkeley after this and attend a lecture and discussion at the Buddhist Center." "Oh, I don't want to go to no such thing. I just want to drink in alleys." "But they're expecting you. I read all your poems there last year." "I don't care. Look at that fog flying over the alley, and look at this warm ruby-red port. Don't it make you feel like singing in the wind?" No, it doesn't. You know, Ray, Cacoethes says you drink too much. And him with his ulcer. Why do you think he has an ulcer? Because he drank too much himself. Do I have an ulcer? Not on your life. I drink for joy. If you don't like my drinking, you can go to the lecture by yourself. I'll wait at Coughlin's cottage. But you'll miss all that just for some old wine. There's wisdom in wine, goddammit, I yelled. Have a shot. No, I won't. Well, then I'll drink it. And I drained the bottle, and we went back on 6th Street, where I immediately jumped back into the same store and bought another poor boy. I was feeling fine now. Jaffe was sad and disappointed. How do you expect to become a good bhikkhu or even a bodhisattva mahasattva always getting drunk like that? Have you forgotten the last of the bulls where he gets drunk with the butchers? Ah, so what? How can you understand your own mind essence with your head all muddled and your teeth all stained and your belly all sick? I'm not sick, I'm fine. I could just float up into that gray fog and fly around San Francisco like a seagull. Did I ever tell you about Skid Row here? I used to live here. I lived on Skid Row in Seattle myself. I know all about all that. The neons of stores and bars were glowing in the gray gloom of rainy afternoon. I felt great. After we had our haircuts, we went into a Goodwill store and fished around bins, pulling out socks and undershirts and various belts and junk that we bought for a few pennies. I kept taking surreptitious slugs of wine out of my bottle, which I had wedged in my belt. Jaffe was disgusted. Then we got in the jalopy and drove to Berkeley, across the rainy bridge, to the cottages of Oakland and then downtown Oakland, where Jaffe wanted to find a pair of jeans that fitted me. We'd been looking all day for used jeans that would fit me. I kept giving him wine, and finally he relented a little and drank some and showed me the poem he had written while I was getting my hair cut in Skid Row. Modern Barber College. Smith, eyes closed, suffers a haircut, fearing its ugliness, 50 cents. A barber student, olive-skinned, Garcia on his coat. 2 blond small boys, one with feared face and big ears, watching from seats. Tell him, "You're ugly, little boy, and you've got big ears." He'd weep and suffer, and it wouldn't even be true. The other, thin-faced, conscious, concentrated, patched blue jeans and scuffed shoes, who watches me. Delicate, suffering child that grows hard and greedy with puberty. Ray and I with poor boy of ruby port in us, rainy May day, no used Levi's in this town, our size. And old Barber College, T&G crappers, Skid Row haircuts, middle-aged barber careers start out now flowering. See, I said, you wouldn't have even written that poem if it wasn't for the wine made you feel good. Ah, I would have written it anyway. You're just drinking too much all the time. I don't see how you're even going to gain enlightenment and manage to stay out in the mountains. You'll always be coming down the hill spending your bean money on wine, and finally you'll end up lying in the street in the rain, dead drunk, and then they'll take you away and you'll have to be reborn a teetotal and bartender to atone for your karma. He was really sad about it, and worried about me, but I just went on drinking. When we got to Alva's cottage and it was time to leave for the Buddhist Center lecture, I said, "I'll just sit here and get drunk and wait for you." "Okay," said Jaffe, looking at me darkly. "It's your life." He was gone for 2 hours. I felt sad and drank too much and was dizzy, but I was determined not to pass out and stick it out and prove something to Jaffe. Suddenly, at dusk, he came running back into the cottage, drunk as a hoot owl, yelling, "You know what happened, Smith? I went to the Buddhist lecture and they were all drinking white, raw sake out of teacups and everybody got drunk. All those crazy Japanese saints. You were right, it doesn't make any difference. We all got drunk and discussed prajna. It was great." And after that, Jaffe and I never had an argument again. Chapter 28. The night of the big party came. I could practically hear the hubbubs of preparation going on down the hill, and felt depressed. Oh my God, sociability is just a big smile, and a big smile is nothing but teeth. I wish I could just stay up here and rest and be kind. But somebody brought up some wine, and that started me off. That night the wine flowed down the hill like a river. Sean had put together a lot of big logs for an immense bonfire in the yard. It was a clear, starry night, warm and pleasant in May. Everybody came. The party soon became clearly divided into 3 parts again. I spent most of my time in the living room where we had Cal Tjader records on the hi-fi, and a lot of girls were dancing as Bud and I and Sean and sometimes Alva and his new buddy George played bongo drums on inverted cans. Out in the yard it was a quieter scene, with the glow of the fire and lots of people sitting on the long logs Sean had placed around the fire, and on the board a spread fit for a king and his hungry retinue. Here by the fire, far from the freneticism of the bongoing living room, cacoethes held forth discussing poetry with the local wits, in tones about like this. Marshall Dashel is too busy cultivating his beard and driving his Mercedes-Benz around cocktail parties in Chevy Chase and up Cleopatra's Needle. O.O. Dowler is being carried around Long Island in limousines and spending his summers shrieking on St. Mark's Place. And tough shit Short, alas, successfully manages to be a Savile Row fop with bowler and waistcoat. And as for Manuel Drubbing, he just flips quarters to see who'll flop in the little reviews. And Omar Tott, I got nothing to say. Albert Law Livingston is busy signing autograph copies of his novels and sending Christmas cards to Sarah Vaughan. Ariadne Jones is importuned by the Ford Company. Leontin McGee says she's old. And who does that leave? Ronald Fairbank, said Coghlan. I guess the only real poets in the country, outside the orbit of this little backyard, are Dr. Musial, who's probably muttering behind his living room curtains right now, and D. Sampson, who's too rich. That leaves us dear old Jaffe here, who's going away to Japan, and our whaling friend Goldbook, and our Mr. Coghlan, who has a sharp tongue. By God, I'm the only good one here. At least I've got an honest anarchist background. At least I had frost on my nose, boots on my feet, and protest in my mouth. He stroked his mustache. What about Smith? Well, I guess he's a bodhisattva in its frightful aspect. It's about all I can say. Aside, sneering, he's too drunk all the time. Henry Morley also came that night, only for a short while, and acted very strange, sitting in the background reading mad comic books in the new magazine called Hip, and left early with the remark, "The hot dogs are too thin. Do you think that's a sign of the times, or are Armour and Swift using stray Mexicans, you think?" Nobody talked to him except me and Jaffe. I was sorry to see him leave so soon. He was ungraspable as a ghost as ever. Nevertheless, he had worn a brand-new brown suit for the occasion, and suddenly he was gone. Up the hill, meanwhile, where the stars nodded on trees, occasional couples were sneaking up to neck or just brought jugs of wine and guitars up and had separate little parties in our shack. It was a great night. Jaffe's father finally came after work, and he was a tight-built little tough guy just like Jaffe, balding a little but completely energetic and crazy just like his son. He immediately began dancing wild mambos with the girls while I beat madly on a can. Go, man! You never saw a more frantic dancer. He stood there, bending way back till he was almost falling over, moving his loins at the girl, sweating, eager, grinning, glad, the maddest father I ever saw. Just recently, at his daughter's wedding, he had broken up the lawn reception by rushing out on his hands and knees with a tiger skin on his back, snapping at the ladies' heels and barking. Now he took a tall, almost 6-foot gal by the name of Jane and swung her around and almost knocked over the bookcase. Jaffe kept wandering to all sections of the party with a big jug in his hand, his face beaming with happiness. For a while, the party in the living room emptied out the bonfire clique, and soon Psyche and Jaffe were doing a mad dance. Then Sean leaped up and whirled her around, and she made as if to swoon and fell right in between Bud and me, sitting on the floor drumming. Bud and I, who never had girls of our own and ignored everything, and lay there a second sleeping on our laps. We puffed on our pipes and drummed on. Polly Whitmore kept hanging around the kitchen, helping Christine with the cooking, and even turning out a batch of delicious cookies of her own. I saw she was lonely because Psyche was there and Jaffe wasn't hers, so I went over to grab her by the waist, but she looked at me with such fear I didn't do anything. She seemed to be terrified of me. Princess was there with her new boyfriend, and she too was pouting in a corner. I said to Jaffe, "What the hell are you going to do with all these broads? Ain't you going to give me one?" "Take whichever one you want. I'm neutral tonight." I went out to the bonfire to hear Cacoethes's latest witticisms. Arthur Wayne was sitting on a log, well-dressed, necktie and suit. And I went over and asked him, Well, what is Buddhism? Is it fantastic imagination magic of the lightning flash? Is it plays, dreams, not even plays, dreams? No, to me Buddhism is getting to know as many people as possible. And there he was, going around the party, real affable, shaking hands with everybody and chatting, a regular cocktail party. The party inside was getting more and more frantic. I began to dance with the tall girl myself. She was wild. I wanted to sneak her up on the hill with a jug, but her husband was there. Later in the night, a crazy colored guy showed up and began playing bongos on his own head and cheeks and mouth and chest, whacking himself with real loud sounds, and a great beat, a tremendous beat. Everybody was delighted and declared he must be a bodhisattva. People of all kinds were pouring in from the city, where news of the great party was going the rounds of our bars. Suddenly I looked up and Alva and George were walking around naked. "What are you doing?" "Oh, we just decided to take our clothes off." Nobody seemed to mind. In fact, I saw Cacoethes and Arthur Wayne, well-dressed, standing, having a polite conversation in the firelight with the two naked madmen. A kind of serious conversation about world affairs. Finally, Jaffe also got naked and wandered around with his jug. Every time one of his girls looked at him, he gave a loud roar and leaped at them, and they ran out of the house squealing. It was insane. I wondered what would ever happen if the cops in Corte Madera got wind of this and came roaring up the hill in their squad cars. The bonfire was bright. Anybody down the road could see everything that was going on in the yard. Nevertheless, it was strangely not out of place to see the bonfire, the food on the board, hear the guitar players, see the dense trees swaying in the breeze, and a few naked men in the party. I talked to Jaffe's father and said, "What do you think about Jaffe being naked?" "Oh, I don't give a damn. Jaff can do anything he wants, far as I'm concerned. Say, where's that big old tall gal we was dancing with?" He was a pure Dharma Bum father. He had had it rough, too, in his early years in the Oregon woods, taking care of a whole family in a cabin he'd built himself, and all the horny-headed troubles of trying to raise crops in merciless country and the cold winters. Now he was a well-to-do painting contractor and had built himself one of the finest houses in Mill Valley and took good care of his sister. Jaffe's own mother was alone, living in a rooming house in the north. Jaffe was going to take care of her when he got back from Japan. I had seen a lonely letter from her. Jaffe said his parents had separated with a great deal of finality, but when he got back from the monastery he would see what he could do to take care of her. Jaffe didn't like to talk about her, and his father, of course, never mentioned her at all. But I liked Jaffe's father, the way he danced, sweating and mad, the way he didn't mind any of the eccentric sights he saw, the way he let everybody do what they wanted anyway and went home around midnight in a shower of thrown flowers, dancing off down to his car parked in the road. Al Lark was another nice guy who was there, just kept sitting sprawled with his guitar, plucking out rumbling, rambling blues chords, or sometimes flamenco, and looking off into space. And when the party was over at 3 a.m., he and his wife went to sleep in sleeping bags in the yard, and I could hear them goofing in the grass. "Let's dance," she said. "I'll go to sleep," he said. Psyche and Jaffe were sore at each other that night, and she didn't want to come up the hill and honor his new white sheets, and stomped off to leave. I watched Jaffe going up the hill, weaving drunk. The party was over. I went with Psyche to her car and said, "Come on, why do you make Jaffe unhappy on his farewell night?" "Oh, he was mean to me, the hell with him." "Aw, come on, nobody'll eat you up the hill." "I don't care. I'm driving back to the city." "Well, that's not nice, and Jaffe told me he loved you." "I don't believe it." "That's the story of life," I said, walking away with a huge jug of wine hooked in my forefinger. And I started up the hill and heard Psyche trying to back up her car and do a U-turn in the narrow road, and the back end landed in the ditch, and she couldn't get out and had to sleep on Christine's floor anyway. Meanwhile, Bud and Coghlan and Alva and George were all up in the shack, sprawled out in various blankets and sleeping bags on the floors. I put my bag down in the sweet grass and felt I was the most fortunate person of the lot. So the party was over, and all the screaming was done, and what was accomplished? I began to sing in the night, enjoying myself with the jug. The stars were blinding bright. "A mosquito as big as Mount Sumeru is much bigger than you think," yelled Coghlan from inside the shack, hearing me sing. I yelled back, "A horse's hoof is more delicate than it looks." Alva came running out in his long underwear and did a big dance and howled long poems in the grass. Finally, we had Bud up talking earnestly about his latest idea. We had a kind of a new party up there. "Let's go down and see how many gals are left." I went down the hill, rolling half the way, and tried to make Psyche come up again, but she was out like a light on the floor. The embers of the big bonfire were still red-hot, and plenty of heat was being given off. Sean was snoring in his wife's bedroom. I took some bread from the board and spread cottage cheese on it and ate and drank wine. I was all alone by the fire, and it was getting gray dawn in the east. "Boy, am I drunk," I said. "Wake up! Wake up!" I yelled. "The goat of day is budding dawn. No ifs or buts. Bang! Come on, you girls, gimps, punks, thieves, pimps, hangmen, run!" Then I suddenly had the most tremendous feeling of the pitifulness of human beings, whatever they were, their faces, pained mouths, personalities, attempts to be gay, little petulances, feelings of loss, their dull and empty witticisms so soon forgotten. Ah, for what? I knew that the sound of silence was everywhere, and therefore everything everywhere was silence. Suppose we suddenly wake up and see that what we thought to be this and that ain't this and that at all. I staggered up the hill, greeted by birds, and looked at all the huddled sleeping figures on the floor. Who were all these strange ghosts rooted to the silly little adventure of earth with me? And who was I? Poor Jaffy. At 8 a.m. he got up and banged on his frying pan and chanted the Gochami chant and called everybody to pancakes. Chapter 29. The party went on for days. The morning of the third day, people were still sprawled about the grounds when Jaffy and I sneaked our rucksacks out, with a few choice groceries, and started down the road in the orange early morning sun of California golden days. It was going to be a great day. We were back in our element, trails. Jaffy was in high spirits. "God damn it, it feels good to get away from dissipation and go in the woods. When I get back from Japan, Ray, when the weather gets really cold, we'll put on our long underwear and hitchhike through the land. Think, if you can, of ocean to mountain, Alaska to Klamath, a solid forest of fir to bickou in, a lake of 1,000,000 wild geese. Whew! You know what woo means in Chinese?" "What?" "Fog. These woods are great here in Marin. I'll show you Muir Woods today, but up north is all that real old Pacific Coast mountain and ocean land, the future home of the Dharma body. Know what I'm going to do? I'll do a new long poem called Rivers and Mountains Without End, and just write it on a scroll and unfold on and on with new surprises and always what went before forgotten, see? Like a river. Or like one of them real long Chinese silk paintings that show two little men hiking in an endless landscape of gnarled old trees and mountains so high they merge with the fog in the upper silk void. I'll spend 3,000 years writing it. It'll be packed full of information on soil conservation, the Tennessee Valley Authority, astronomy, geology, Xuanzung's travels, Chinese painting theory, reforestation, oceanic ecology, and food chains. Go to it, boy. As ever, I strode on behind him, and when we began to climb with our packs feeling good on our backs as though we were pack animals and didn't feel right without a burden, it was that same old lonesome old good old thwap up the trail, slowly, a mile an hour. We came to the end of the steep road where we had to go through a few houses built near steep bushy cliffs with waterfalls trickling down, then up to a high steep meadow full of butterflies and hay and a little 7 a.m. dew, and down to a dirt road, then to the end of the dirt road, which rose higher and higher till we could see vistas of Corte Madera and Mill Valley far away, and even the red top of Golden Gate Bridge. "Tomorrow afternoon, on our run to Stimson Beach," said Jaffy, "you'll see the whole white city of San Francisco miles away in the blue bay. Ray, by God, later on in our future life, we can have a fine freewheeling tribe in these California hills. Get girls and have dozens of radiant, enlightened brats. Live like Indians in hogans and eat berries and buds." "No beans?" "We'll write poems. We'll get a printing press and print our own poems, the Dharma Press. We'll poetize the lot and make a fat book of icy bombs for the booby public." "Ah, the public ain't so bad. They suffer too. You always read about some tar paper shack burning somewhere in the Middle West with 3 little children perishing, and you see a picture of the parents crying. Even the kitty was burned. Jaffe, do you think God made the world to amuse himself because he was bored? Because if so, he would have to be mean. Who would you mean by God? Just Tathagata, if you will. Well, it says in the sutra that God, or Tathagata, doesn't himself emanate a world from his womb, but it just appears due to the ignorance of sentient beings. But he emanated the sentient beings and their ignorance, too. It's all too pitiful. I ain't gonna rest till I find out why, Jaffe. Why? Don't trouble your mind essence. Remember that in pure Tathagata mind essence there is no asking of the question why, and not even any significance attached to it. Well, then nothing's really happening then. He threw a stick at me and hit me on the foot. Well, that didn't happen, I said. I really don't know, Ray, but I appreciate your sadness about the world. 'Tis indeed. Look at that party the other night. Everybody wanted to have a good time and tried real hard, but we all woke up the next day feeling sort of sad and separate. What do you think about death, Ray? I think death is our reward. When we die, we go straight to Nirvana heaven, and that's that. But supposing you're reborn in the lower hells and have hot, red-hot balls of iron shoved down your throat by devils. Life's already shoved an iron foot down my mouth. But I don't think that's anything but a dream cooked up by some hysterical monks who didn't understand Buddha's peace under the bow tree, or for that matter, Christ's peace, looking down on the heads of his tormentors and forgiving them. You really like Christ, don't you? Of course I do. And after all, a lot of people say he is Maitreya, the Buddha prophesied to appear after Sakyamuni. You know, Maitreya means love in Sanskrit, and that's all Christ talked about was love. Oh, don't start preaching Christianity to me. I can just see you on your deathbed kissing the cross like some old Karamazov, or like our old friend Dwight Goddard, who spent his life as a Buddhist and suddenly returned to Christianity in his last days. That's not for me. I want to spend hours every day in a lonely temple meditating in front of a sealed statue of Kwannon, which no one is ever allowed to see because it's too powerful. Strike hard, old diamond. It'll all come out in the wash. You remember Raul Sturluson, my buddy who went to Japan to study those rocks of Ryoanji? He went over on a freighter named Sea Serpent, so he painted a big mural of a sea serpent and mermaids on a bulkhead in the mess hall to the delight of the crew, who dug him like crazy and all wanted to become Dharma Bums right there. Now he's climbing up Holy Mount Hiei in Kyoto, through a foot of snow probably, straight up where there are no trails, steep, through bamboo thickets and twisty pine like in brush drawings. Feet wet and lunch forgot. That's the way to climb. What are you going to wear in the monastery anyway? Oh man, the works. Old Tang Dynasty-style things. Long, black floppy with huge droopy sleeves and funny pleats. Make you feel real Oriental. Alva says that while guys like us are all excited about being real Orientals and wearing robes, actual Orientals over there are reading Surrealism and Charles Darwin and mad about Western business suits. East'll meet West anyway. Think what a great world revolution will take place when East meets West finally. And it'll be guys like us that can start the thing. Think of millions of guys all over the world with rucksacks on their backs, tramping around the backcountry and hitchhiking and bringing the word down to everybody. That's a lot like the early days of the Crusades, Walter the Penniless and Peter the Hermit leading ragged bands of believers to the Holy Land. Yeah, but that was all such European gloom and crap. I want my Dharma Bums to have springtime in their hearts when the blooms are girling and the birds are dropping little fresh turds, surprising cats who wanted to eat them a moment ago. What are you thinking about? Just making up poems in my head as I climb toward Mount Tamalpais. See up there ahead, as beautiful a mountain as you'll see anywhere in the world, a beautiful shape to it. I really love Tamalpais. We'll sleep tonight way around the back of it. Take us till late afternoon to get there. The Marin country was much more rustic and kindly than the rough Sierra country we'd climbed last fall. It was all flowers, trees, bushes, but also a great deal of poison oak by the side of the trail. When we got to the end of the high dirt road, we suddenly plunged into the dense redwood forest and went along following a pipeline through glades that were so deep the fresh morning sun barely penetrated, and it was cold and damp. But the odor was pure, deep, rich pine and wet logs. Jaffe was all talk this morning. He was like a little kid again now that he was out on the trail. The only thing wrong with that monastery shot in Japan for me is, though for all their intelligence and good intentions, the Americans out there, they have so little sense of America and who the people are who really dig Buddhism here, and they don't have any use for poetry. Who? Well, the people who are sending me out there and finance things. They spend their good money fixing elegant scenes of gardens and books and Japanese architecture and all that crap, which nobody will like or be able to use anyway but rich American divorcees on Japanese cruises. And all they really should do is just build or buy an old Jap house and vegetable garden and have a place there for cats to hang out in and be Buddhists. I mean, have a real flower of something and not just the usual American middle-class fug-up with appearances. Anyway, I'm looking forward to it. Oh boy, I can just see myself in the mornings sitting on the mats with a low table at my side, typing on my portable, and my hibachi nearby with a pot of hot water on it keeping hot, and all my papers and maps and pipe and flashlight neatly packed away, and outside plum trees and pines with snow on the boughs, and up on Mount Hiezan the snow getting deep, and sugi and hinoki all around, them's redwoods, boy, and cedars. Little tucked-away temples down the rocky trails, cold mossy ancient places where frogs croak, and inside small statues and hanging buttery lamps, and gold lotuses and paintings and ancient incense-soaked smells and lacquered chests with statues. His boat was leaving in 2 days. But I'm sad, too, about leaving California. That's why I wanted to take one last long look at it today with you, Ray.